The morning in Ouagadougou should have been like any other. Women carried baskets toward the market, children raced through dusty streets toward their schools, and shopkeepers raised shutters with the rhythm of routine. Then suddenly, silence fell. All eyes turned upward. Cutting across the African sky was a shape unlike anything they had ever seen before, sleek, ghost-like, almost invisible. It was not a French helicopter. It was not an American drone. It was something new. A Russian Su-57 stealth fighter. For the people of Burkina Faso, this single glimpse was not just about technology. It was a promise that their skies no longer belonged to foreign powers, that sovereignty could finally be visible above their heads. For generals in Washington, Brussels, and Paris, it was a nightmare, because the Su-57 was never supposed to appear here in Africa. For decades, NATO's F-16s symbolized absolute control of the air. But what happens when a fifth-generation jet built to evade radar and outmaneuver anything in its path begins to circle over African soil? This is not just a military story. It is about dignity, independence, and the courage of a young African leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, who dared to stand shoulder to shoulder with Vladimir Putin and declare that Burkina Faso would no longer accept second-hand protection. The site of the Su-57 has become a question for the world. Is Africa finally carving its own path in the 21st century, or is it being pulled into a firestorm too dangerous to contain? So I ask you directly, do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's bold gamble is the key to breaking NATO's grip, or could it ignite a larger conflict that threatens all of us? Please share this video if you feel you are among the first to witness this historic shift. Subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines. When Ibrahim Traoré took power in Burkina Faso, he spoke again and again of one word that had been repeated in Africa for generations, but rarely made real sovereignty. For Traoré, sovereignty was not a slogan to impress diplomats or a line to deliver at international conferences. It had to be something visible, something ordinary citizens could see, touch, and believe. And he knew there was no greater test of sovereignty than the sky. Whoever commands the skies commands the future. For decades, Africa's skies were treated as NATO's backyard. Old French Mirage jets and American-made F-16s flew in and out of bases on the continent, often without question, their presence taken as natural. Africa, the world was told, could not defend itself. It could only borrow protection. But by the summer of 2025, whispers began to circulate in Ouagadougou and Bamako of a partnership that would challenge this assumption. Traoré did not settle for more of the same. He went further than any African leader before him. First, he invited Russian instructors to train Burkina Faso's soldiers, strengthening the fight against armed groups and cross-border insurgencies. But then came the shocking move. The door was opened to Russia's crown jewel, the Su-57, a fifth-generation stealth fighter designed to compete directly with America's most celebrated aircraft. The Su-57 was not just another jet. Its very design spoke of a new age of warfare. Built with radar-absorbing composites, equipped with engines capable of supercruise flight, and armed with beyond-visual range missiles, it represented the cutting edge of aerial dominance. In simulation after simulation, Western analysts admitted privately that the Su-57 could outgun and outmaneuver even upgraded F-16 squadrons. The thought of such technology stationed in West Africa unsettled the entire balance of power. Inside Burkina Faso, however, the atmosphere was electric. Crowds poured into the streets waving posters of Traoré alongside images of sleek Russian aircraft. Fireworks lit up Ouagadougou as citizens chanted slogans of sovereignty. In marketplaces, women told journalists, "If they fear our skies, maybe they will finally respect our land." On the motorcycles of young men, the outline of the Su-57 appeared as hand-painted symbols of pride. To ordinary people, long used to the sound of foreign drones buzzing overhead, the idea of advanced fighters defending their airspace was nothing short of revolutionary. Moscow seized the moment. Russian state television broadcast jubilant footage of Burkina crowds cheering as equipment was unloaded from cargo planes. For Vladimir Putin, this was more than a military transaction, it was a geopolitical signal. Russia was no longer confined to Ukraine or the Arctic. Its reach now extended into the very heart of NATO's former colonial sphere. And unlike in Eastern Europe, where Moscow faced hostility, here in Africa, the people themselves welcomed the alliance. Western intelligence agencies quickly noticed. Satellite images revealed Russian aircraft arriving at airstrips in Burkina Faso. Reports filtered back to Washington and Brussels, sparking urgent questions. Could NATO still assume air dominance over Africa? Could their decades-long advantage be slipping away, not through war but through a handshake between a young African leader and the Kremlin? The Traore government framed the move carefully. This was not aggression, they insisted, but defense. The Sahel had been battered for years, terrorist groups striking villages, covert operations undermining stability, foreign forces intervening without solving the crisis. Why should Europe and America be allowed to deploy thousands of troops, drones, and warplanes, while Africa was told to settle for outdated hardware? Why could an African leader not demand the very best for his people? For supporters, the message was clear. Burkina Faso was no longer a pawn, it was a player. For critics, both domestic and international, it was a dangerous gamble. By inviting Russia's most advanced weapon into Africa, Traoré risked drawing the Sahel into a confrontation between great powers. But even those critics could not deny the transformation in perception. For the first time in living memory, Africans were not waiting for second-hand protection. They were negotiating for the best on their own terms. And so the skies above Burkina Faso became more than airspace. They became a stage where sovereignty was no longer whispered, but declared, painted across the horizon in the form of a stealth fighter. For Traoré and for millions of Africans, this was not only about jets, it was about dignity, about showing the world that Africa could no longer be ignored. The real storm did not break first in Ouagadougou, but in Brussels. Behind closed doors at NATO headquarters, maps of Africa were spread across polished tables dotted with red and blue markers. Military analysts, their voices lowered, whispered the same fear. If even a handful of Su-57s were stationed in the Sahel, NATO's uncontested dominance over African skies would be shattered. For decades, the American-made F-16 had been the workhorse of Western air power. Reliable, sleek, and combat-tested, it had patrolled skies from the Middle East to Eastern Europe. But the F-16 was born in the 1970s, an era before stealth technology, before infrared suppression, before radar-absorbing composites. By contrast, the Su-57 was engineered for the future. It could evade detection strike from beyond visual range and maneuver in ways that defied the physics of older aircraft. NATO ran the simulations. Again and again, the results were the same. In mock dogfights, the F-16 squadron struggled to detect the Su-57 until it was already too late. Off the record, pilots admitted the uncomfortable truth. You can't fight what you can't see. Billions in upgrades could not erase the fact that Africa's skies might no longer belong to the West. The panic reached Washington. A leaked Pentagon memo warned of a new strategic front opening in Africa. Senators appeared on television demanding answers. Are we going to allow Russia to plant stealth jets in our backyard? One asked angrily. Defense contractors saw opportunity pushing for more drones, more radars, more bases. But beneath the noise was something deeper, the realization that America's aura of invincibility was cracking. European capitals echoed the unease. In Paris, the humiliation was personal. Only months earlier, French forces had been expelled from Mali and Burkina Faso. Now, to see Russian fighters welcomed where French soldiers had been rejected, cut into France's pride like a wound reopened. Germany's defense minister admitted bluntly, "If we lose the skies of Africa, we lose the continent." British tabloids plastered sensational headlines across their front pages, "Putin's ghost fighters haunt Africa." Then came the symbolic high point. In Ouagadougou, Burkinabe troops marched side by side with Russian officers in a joint parade. Overhead, a low-flying aircraft roared across the sky, its sleek body glinting in the sun. Was it truly a Su-57 or a carefully staged illusion? It hardly mattered. For the people on the ground, it was real. They applauded, waved flags, and shouted chants of sovereignty. For NATO analysts watching the footage, it was terrifying. This was the climax, not a battle, but a perception. Power is measured not only by missiles and radars, but by the fear it inspires and the confidence it brings. For the first time, NATO officials admitted they might be denied access to African airspace. For the first time, Africans felt their leaders were not passive recipients of foreign protection, but active players reshaping the rules of the game. Reactions rippled across the world. In Moscow, state television declared it a triumph, broadcasting images of cheering Burkinabe crowds under the shadow of Russian planes. In Washington, political debate grew bitter, hawks warning of a new Cold War in Africa, doves asking whether U.S. taxpayers should fund yet another foreign entanglement. In Brussels, defense budgets became battlegrounds, with some leaders demanding escalation and others warning of humiliation if NATO stumbled. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, none of that mattered. Mothers whispered that they finally slept without the constant hum of foreign drones. Farmers said, "At last, our skies are ours." Young people painted Su-57 silhouettes on their scooters, while student groups framed the jet as more than a weapon, it was a metaphor for dignity. What NATO feared most was not the presence of a few Russian aircraft. It was the possibility that Africa itself had changed. A continent once treated as a chessboard for foreign empires now stood on the verge of becoming a player. And at the center of it all was Captain Ibrahim Traoré, whose gamble had forced the world to take notice. The roar of the Su-57 may have been faint in the skies, but on the ground in Burkina Faso, its echo was unmistakable. For ordinary citizens, the sight or even the rumor of Russian stealth fighters circling above was more than a military development. It was a psychological shield. Mothers in Ouagadougou spoke of finally sleeping through the night without the dread of foreign drones buzzing overhead. Farmers in the Sahel, long terrorized by cross-border raids and shadowy militias, began to say with quiet pride, "At last, our skies are ours." This new sense of safety quickly translated into politics. President Ibrahim Traoré's popularity, already rising, surged to levels unseen in recent African history. In city squares, crowds held placards of his portrait alongside hand-drawn silhouettes of the Su-57. They chanted not for aid or charity, but for sovereignty now. For a leader often painted in Western media as inexperienced or reckless, the symbolism of standing shoulder to shoulder with Russia's most advanced technology transformed him into something larger, a living emblem of Africa's defiance. The ripple effects spread beyond Burkina Faso. Across the Sahel Alliance, Mali, Niger, and now Burkina Faso leaders read the message clearly. If Traoré could negotiate for stealth aircraft, what stopped them from doing the same? Joint defense councils began to discuss integrated radar systems, shared air defense networks, and even the possibility of a multinational African stealth squadron. Suddenly, the Sahel was no longer a collection of fragile states begging for protection. It was becoming a bloc with teeth, and the world noticed. But within Burkina Faso, not all voices were celebratory. Opposition politicians warned that deeper ties with Russia could entangle the country in great power rivalries far beyond its control. Human rights advocates worried that advanced weapons and stronger alliances might embolden authoritarian tendencies at home. "We wanted sovereignty, yes," one activist said, "but will sovereignty mean freedom or just a different master?" Even among critics, however, there was no denying the raw enthusiasm pouring from the streets. The African Union found itself divided. Some leaders applauded Burkina Faso's boldness, framing it as a long-overdue rejection of dependency. Others cautioned that the continent risked becoming once again a battleground for outside powers, this time not Europe alone, but a confrontation between NATO and Moscow. Debates grew sharper. Was this the dawn of true independence or the prelude to another proxy war? Meanwhile, African civil society began to shape the narrative in its own terms. Intellectual circles, student groups, and religious leaders described the Su-57 not only as military hardware, but as a metaphor for dignity. "For decades, we were told we could only fly with borrowed wings," a professor in Bamako remarked. "Now we are building wings of our own." In sermons, imams and pastors alike spoke of skies no longer owned by strangers. The sense of empowerment bled into discussions of democracy development and the meaning of independence in the 21st century. The political consequences for Traoré were profound. No longer viewed as a transitional caretaker, he was elevated in the eyes of many Africans as the face of a continental shift. His gamble had reshaped the perception of what African leadership could mean. And as his stature grew, the question hanging in the air was no longer whether Africa could defend itself, but whether the West was prepared to accept an Africa that refused to bow. In Washington, the mood was tense and uncertain. For decades, Africa had been an afterthought in U.S. foreign policy, a place for aid programs, counterterrorism bases, and carefully worded speeches about democracy. But the arrival of Russian Su-57s in African skies jolted the establishment awake. The Pentagon convened emergency sessions. Intelligence briefings filled the White House Situation Room. The question on every official's lips was chillingly simple: have we lost Africa? For U.S. military planners, the nightmare was clear. The F-16, once considered untouchable, now looked outdated. Generals admitted privately that sending American pilots into a dogfight against Russian stealth fighters in the Sahel would be a gamble. Losing even a single encounter would not just be a tactical setback, it would be a humiliation broadcast worldwide. A single American jet falling in African skies could shatter the image of U.S. dominance that had been carefully cultivated for generations. Politically, the debate in Washington grew fierce. Republican lawmakers accused the administration of sleepwalking into a new Cold War. Democrats countered that reckless escalation could drag America into yet another costly foreign conflict far from home and against the wishes of an already war-weary public. Talk show hosts asked whether U.S. taxpayers should really fund another foreign military buildup in Africa when hospitals and schools back home were struggling. The American people, exhausted by Iraq and Afghanistan, showed little appetite for another front line, this time in the Sahel. Across the Atlantic, European capitals were just as unsettled. In Paris, the wound was personal. France had been expelled from Burkina Faso and Mali only months earlier, and now Russian fighters were being cheered where French troops had once marched. Newspapers in Paris called the Su-57 a ghost of colonial defeat. Germany's policymakers worried openly that NATO unity was fraying, with some countries demanding stronger action, while others preferred to ignore the Sahel altogether. In London, tabloids splashed lurid headlines across their front pages: Putin's jets stalk Africa. Moscow, by contrast, celebrated. Russian state media showed endless footage of cheering Burkina Faso crowds, framing it as proof that the global South was rejecting Western dominance. For Vladimir Putin, it was more than military cooperation, it was a geopolitical triumph. Africa had become a stage where Russia, not the West, was winning applause. And then there was China, watching carefully, saying little. Beijing did not need to supply fighter jets. It only needed to wait, invest, and expand its economic footprint wherever the West hesitated. A weakened NATO presence in Africa could mean new doors opening for Chinese influence, from infrastructure projects to trade agreements. Other African nations also took note. In Accra, Dakar, and Johannesburg, leaders debated quietly: should they distance themselves from Traore's bold gamble or prepare for a future where Western protection was no longer guaranteed. Within the African Union, the division was clear. Some hailed Burkina Faso's defiance as historic, others warned that the continent risked once again being drawn into great power conflict. But perhaps the most profound shift was symbolic. Around the world, commentators began asking questions that would have been unthinkable only a few years earlier. Could NATO actually be outmaneuvered? Could America's technological dominance be challenged by a small African nation standing with Moscow? The very act of asking revealed how much the balance of perception had already shifted. For the West, the Su-57 was not just a jet. It was a mirror, forcing them to confront the reality that Africa was no longer content to remain a passive stage for foreign games. Under Ibrahim Traoré, it had become an actor in its own right. And that, more than any aircraft, was what terrified Washington and Brussels most. The story of the Su-57 in Burkina Faso does not end in the sky. It ends in the hearts of millions who for the first time dared to believe that their continent could chart its own course. For the Burkinabe mother who whispers to her children, "Sleep well, the sky is ours now." For the farmer in the Sahel who no longer scans the horizon in fear of foreign drones. For the young student who paints the silhouette of a stealth jet on his notebook and dreams not of exile, but of building a future at home. Yet history warns us, whenever small nations acquire the means to challenge empires, the empires rarely remain silent. The roar of the Su-57 is both a shield and a provocation. NATO may hesitate today, but tomorrow will Burkina Faso and its allies find themselves dragged into a proxy war they never sought. Will Africa's bold pursuit of dignity become the spark for a wider conflict between East and West? These questions hang heavy over the continent and indeed over the world. For the United States, the lesson is sobering. For decades, Washington believed it could dictate the tempo of world events. But sovereignty is contagious. When one nation stands, others take notice. When those nations link arms, its old rules begin to crumble. And no Pentagon briefing, no Senate hearing can fully contain the force of a continent that refuses to bow. For Africa, the challenge is just as great. True independence requires more than jets and parades. It demands wisdom, unity, and the courage to resist becoming someone else's battlefield. Ibrahim Traoré's gamble may be remembered as the spark of a new era or as the trigger of a storm too powerful to control. Only time will tell. And so I leave you with this. Do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's bold reforms, his demand for sovereignty, his gamble with Russia are the key to real independence? Or do they risk dragging Africa into a firestorm it cannot contain? Can we continue to trust Traoré to carry this vision forward, or must another generation step in to safeguard the dream? Please share this video if you feel you are among the first to witness this historic turning point. Subscribe if you believe that sovereignty and truth matter more than headlines. And leave your voice in the comments. Will Africa's skies belong to its people, or will they remain the playground of distant empires? Because what happens in Burkina Faso will not stay in Burkina Faso. It will shape the balance of power for the 21st century.